Namaskaram, Michael.
Namaskaram.
Thank you for having this meeting again. This is the seventh meeting in a series of eight meetings that we are having, eight talks about the eight essential key points of Bhagavan's teachings. And you mentioned those eight key points in an introduction that you wrote for a book that I compiled based on your translations and explanations of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu.
Yes.
And if people are interested in reading your introduction and haven't done that yet, and I highly recommend it, it's available on your website. And if I remember the date correctly, it's on the 10th of September 2024 that they can read a slightly adjusted introduction that is also, that you made available for the book.
Yeah.
So for anyone who is watching, I thought it was good to repeat the key points that we already talked about, because it also will make sense if I say what the seventh one is. So let me share my screen. So the first key point that we talked about is what actually exists is only ourselves as we actually are. The second one is what we actually are is just pure being awareness, Sat Chit, which is what always shines as our own being, our fundamental awareness, I am, and which is the infinite fullness of perfect happiness, Ananda. We seem to be not aware of ourselves as we actually are, only because we now seem to have risen as ego, whose nature is to be always aware of itself as I am this body, and consequently aware of the appearance of other things. The fourth key point is, since ego is an erroneous awareness of ourself, it can be eradicated only by correct awareness of ourself, which means awareness of ourself as we actually are. And the fifth key point that we talked about is, since we seem to be ego only so long as we attend to and are therefore aware of anything other than ourselves, we can be aware of ourselves as we actually are, and thereby eradicate ego only by attending to ourselves so keenly that we thereby cease to be aware of anything else whatsoever. And the sixth key point is, everything other than our own being, I am, is just an illusory appearance that seems to exist only in the view of ourselves as ego. So all such things seem to exist only when we rise and stand as ego, and hence none of them exist at all when we do not rise as ego. And then the key point for today that especially you are going to talk about is, our rising as ego is therefore the root cause for the appearance of all other things, including all problems and all forms of suffering. And the appearance of all other things, I can equate that, of course, with duality, and all problems and all forms of suffering as samsara.
Yes, yes.
So could you please speak more about the seventh key point?
Right, okay. This seventh key point is, this is the very heart of Bhagavan's teachings. That is, according to Advaita, there is one only without a second. And that one thing is ourself as we actually are. As the Upanishads say, Tattvamasi, you are that. And it's also from the Upanishad, this term, ekam eva advaitiyam, one only without a second, comes. So this is the fundamental principle of Vedanta, at least particularly from a Advaitic perspective. For people who interpret Vedanta in other ways, because Vedanta is deliberately open to being interpreted in different ways to suit the needs of different people. So there are many different interpretations of Vedanta. All are appropriate for people at different stages of spiritual development. But at least from an Advaitic point of view, we can say not that Advaita is the only true interpretation. All are true in the sense that they help people along the path, but from an Advaitic point of view, Advaita is the deepest interpretation, the ultimate interpretation. So from a Advaitic point of view, the fact that there's one only without a second, this is what Advaita means. Advaita means non-two-ness, but if we go back to a root of, I mean, why it is called non-two-ness, it is because of this principle expressed in the Upanishads that there's one only without a second. Actually, in the Upanishads, it's not, it said, in the beginning there was one only without a second, and that one was Sat, being. But according to Advaita, that one always remains as it is, so everything else is just an appearance. So if there is only one thing, but we experience many things, we experience all this multiplicity must be just an appearance. It cannot be real. If what is actually exists is only one, all these things, though they seem to exist, they do not actually exist. So they are unreal. They are just an illusory appearance. This is the core teaching of Advaita Vedanta. But Bhagavan goes one step further than that. Bhagavan says, yes, all this is just an appearance, but to whom does it appear? That is a question that is not addressed so thoroughly in classical Advaita as it is in Bhagavan's teachings. According to Bhagavan, all this multiplicity appears only in the view of ego. So since multiplicity appears only in the view of ego, ego is therefore the root for the appearance of all this multiplicity. So as I wrote in this second point, our rising as ego is therefore the root cause for the appearance of all other things, including all problems and all forms of suffering. That is, when we do not rise as ego, asleep, as in sleep, sorry, we don't experience anything other than ourself. All we're aware of in sleep is our own being, I am. And our being is obviously not an object of awareness, so it is just pure awareness. Awareness knowing nothing other than itself. That is our real state. But so since we're not aware of anything else, there's no suffering, no problems of any kind. But as soon as we rise as ego in waking or dream, all this multiplicity appears. And with multiplicity brings all sorts of problems with it. Because when we experience multiplicity, we experience ourselves as a part of that multiplicity. That is, as Bhagavan said, this entire waking state is nothing but a dream. And in a dream, we always experience ourselves as a person, as a body within that dream. That is why, though the dream is our own creation, we seem to not have control of our creation because we, instead of experiencing ourselves as a creator, we experience ourselves as a creature. We experience ourselves as a part of our creation. So this whole world is just a mental fabrication, a creation of the mind. But we, as ego, we experience ourselves as a body which is a part of this creation. Because we experience ourselves as a small part of this creation, we seem not to have control over all the things that are happening. So by rising as ego, we get ourselves in a right mess. We limit ourselves as a body, and as a body we face all sorts of problems. As a body we need air to breathe, we need water to drink, we need food. If the body we identify as I is a human body, in most climates we need some form of clothing. If we're in a cold climate, because we're hairless creatures, or more or less hairless creatures. We don't have body hair like most other animals. So we need clothing to keep us warm in cold climates, and we need clothing to protect us from the sun in hot climates. So we depend on so many things. Once we take ourselves to be when we mistake ourselves to be a body, and the nature of the body, if the body is born, it goes through all the trouble of growing up as a child and going through all the teenage years, and then struggling to make a living for so many years, and then finally the body gets old and it doesn't work as well as it used to, and slowly it begins to decay, and sooner or later we face death. And on the way, there are so many other problems. We often experience various forms of ill health, various diseases come to us, and often disease brings about a premature end of this bodily life. Or there are other problems. There can be, if we are in an area where there's famine, we can not have adequate food. And famines are caused not only by climatic conditions, they're also often caused by human actions, as we see in wars and so on. War is another major problem people face. Even in times of peace, there are accidents. Nowadays, one of the most common forms of premature death is dying in car accidents. So there's so many things. And even if we haven't an accident, for instance, a car accident, it may not kill us, but it may maim us permanently. So it's once we take ourselves as a body, problems are inevitable, suffering is inevitable. Of course, we in the course of our life, there are moments of joy, moments of relative calmness and peace and so on. But this is always accompanied by suffering in one form or another. Even if we live a healthy life, relatively free of disease, there are those who are dear to us, and sooner or later they pass away, and then we suffer bereavement. So many problems come when we limit ourselves as a body. But all this occurs because we rise as ego. Only when we rise as ego, that is, as soon as we rise as ego, we project a body and identify it as I, and through the five senses of that body, we project an external world. So we seem to be just a small part of this world we have created. So all problems and sufferings arise only when we rise as ego. And in fact, everything arises when we rise as ego. This is a point that Bhagavan repeatedly emphasizes in Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu. I will cite a few verses. The first verse in which Bhagavan, well, there are earlier verses, but this ninth verse, it makes this particularly clear. What he says in the ninth verse is, usually when translated, it's translated as dyads and triads, but dyads means two things, triads mean three things. But what dyads and triads is being talked about, this actually in Tamil, these words have a particular meaning. That is, irretegal means pairs of opposites. Irretegal means pairs, but in this context, it means pairs of opposites. So pairs of opposites are things such as existence and non-existence, life and death, awareness and non-awareness, knowledge and ignorance, happiness and unhappiness, good and bad, liberation and bondage, and so on. So all pairs of opposites are what are referred to here as dyads. And the triad, the term used by Bhagavan in Tamil, is mupadigal. Mupadi is a Tamil form of a technical Sanskrit word, triputi. Triputi means the three factors of transitive knowledge or awareness, namely the knower, the what is known, and the means by which it is known. So the terms that are usually used in Sanskrit are either jnata, the knower, jnana, the knowing, and jnaya, what is known, or even more technically, the pramata is the knower, pramana is the means of knowing, and prameya is what is known, whatever is known, namely objects or phenomena, or facts or theories or whatever. Anything that is known is prameya. The means by which we know it is pramana, and ego, the knower of it, is pramata. The means of knowing is, just to clarify what this means, because we're all familiar with talking about subject and object, that is the knower and the thing known. But in Advaita philosophy, they also emphasize you can't have, there cannot be anything known without a means of knowing it. So there are many different means by which we know things. We know some things by seeing them, other things by hearing, or by tasting or touching or smelling. That's so sensory perception is one means of knowing, or 5 means of knowing, let's say. We experience things in various ways. We also infer things. We logically infer things. Sometimes some of our logical inferences, the inferences some inferences are what necessarily follows, but many inferences are what is most probable, what seems to be most likely. So logical reasoning and inferring is another means of knowing. We also, probably most of the things we claim to know are things we don't actually know directly. We merely believe reliable testimony. We believe, for example, there's so many scientific findings. The vast majority of us, and even if we happen to be scientists, we will be specialized in a particular area of science. There are so many other areas of science we don't have any direct experience of. So we believe the findings of science because it is reliable testimony. It's not always, I mean, science isn't always right, and often scientific conclusions change over time. But science is, in many contexts, the most reliable information, knowledge way. It means we have of knowing about the external world, about the behavior of the external world. We also believe what we read in the news, for example. But obviously, news outlets, some are more reliable, some are less reliable. Nowadays, we have social media where people can say anything and everything, and some people will believe it, even though in many cases it's completely false. So we have to use discrimination. But I'm going a bit off topic. I'm just explaining what these three are: the knower, the means of knowing, and the thing that is known. So what Bhagavan says in this verse, these dyads and triads always exist holding one thing. He doesn't here say what that one thing is, but if we understand Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu correctly, we will understand that one thing, the root of all other things, is ego. And Bhagavan himself, when he explained this verse to Lakshman Sharma and to others, he made it very clear that the one he's talking about here is ego. So when he said they always exist holding one thing, the word he uses for holding is patri. which literally means holding or grasping, but it also is often used in the sense of depending on. So without ego, the knower, there would be no pairs of opposites, and there would be this triad also wouldn't exist. That is, there cannot be anything known without a means of knowing it, and there cannot be anything known or a means of knowing it without a knower. So the knower is the base of all knowledge. And likewise, all the pairs of opposites, they are things that are known by us. So they depend upon us, the knower. So what Bhagavan says in this first sentence, dyads and triads always exist, always holding one thing, implies that everything, all multiplicity, everything that is known, and the means of knowing it all depend upon ego. And then he goes on to say, and this is another very important idea which is central to Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, and this is the first verse in which he makes this very clear. He says, if one sees within the mind what that one thing is, they will slip off. That one thing is ego. They here refers to the dyads and triads. So if we see within the mind what this ego is, dyads and triads will slip off. What does this imply? They will slip off is a way of saying they will cease to exist. That is, dyads and triads depend upon ego for their seeming existence, because they seem to exist only in the view of ego. And as Bhagavan makes clear in many verses of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, particularly in verse 25, the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to things other than itself. But if it attends to itself, it will subside and dissolve back into its source. So if we investigate ourselves keenly enough and see what this ego is, ego as such will cease to exist, and everything else will cease to exist along with it. That's what's implied here. When he says, if one sees what that one thing is, what exactly does that mean? That is, if we look at ego, if we attend keenly to ego to see what it actually is, what ego actually is just Satchit, the pure being awareness. That is what ego essentially is. But ego as ego is always that Satchit conflated with adjuncts. That is, we wrongly experience ourselves as I am this body, in which the term body refers to not just the physical form of the body, but to all the five sheaths, the panchakosha. That is the physical form of the body, the life that animates it, the mind, intellect, and will that function within it. These five are called the panchakosha. This is, as Bhagavan explained in an earlier verse, verse 5, when he uses the term body, he's referring to all these five. Why? Because we never experience ourselves as a body without experiencing all these five collectively as ourselves. That is, we never experience ourselves as a dead body. So whatever body we experience is always a body endowed with life. So that's the first of the two sheaths, the physical body and the life, the prana, the breath, all the physiological processes within the body. And we also never experience ourselves as a sleeping body. It's always the body, but we experience as I always seems to be awake. That is not only in the waking state, even in dream. When we're dreaming, we seem to be awake. So we experience ourselves as if we were waking in dream. And now also we experience ourselves as if we were waking, though this is actually just a dream. So in this seemingly waking state, there is not only the physical form of the body and the life, there's also a mind, an intellect, and a will operating within that body. So all these five collectively are what we experience as ourself. So when we rise as ego, we identify ourselves as a body, and so we see all this multiplicity. When we turn our attention back towards ourselves to see what this ego actually is, we are not looking at the adjuncts that ego mistakes itself to be. The adjuncts means this body consisting of 5 sheaths, because that is the body, the physical form of the body, the life, the mind, the intellect, and the will. These are things that are not what we actually are. These are things that we mistake ourselves to be. So when we as ego investigate ourselves, we are not investigating any of these adjuncts. We're investigating the basic awareness I am, the awareness of our own being. So that is Sat-Chit. So when we attend to ego carefully enough, we will see that it is just Sat-Chit. Just like if you see a rope and mistake it to be a snake, if you look at it carefully, you'll see, oh, it's not actually a snake, it's just a rope. Likewise, if we look at ego carefully enough to see what it actually is just Sat-Chit. And Sat-Chit is not ego. That is, ego is nothing but Sat-Chit, but Sat-Chit is not ego. So just like the rope is nothing, the snake is nothing but a rope, but the rope is not a snake. So when we look at ego, ego as ego ceases to exist. Just like if when we see the rope and mistake it to be a snake, we experience fear. The fear is a result of mistaking it to be a snake. But if we look at it carefully enough to see that it's not a snake, it's just a rope, as soon as we see it's a rope, the fear will also disappear. In this case, the fear is analogous to all the other things we experience, because we experience all these other things only when we rise as ego and therefore mistake ourselves to be a body. So when Bhagavan says, if one sees within the mind what that one thing is, that is, if we see within the mind what ego is, what it actually is just Sat-Chit. As soon as we see it as Sat-Chit, it ceases to be ego. And since it ceases to be ego, the dyads and triads which depend upon ego will slip off. They will cease to exist. So this is another very important principle of Bhagavan's teachings, that the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to things other than itself, but to subside and dissolve back into its source only by attending to itself. That is, since awareness of things other than ourselves, that is, what is aware of other things is ego. So long as we're aware of anything other than ourselves, we experience ourselves as ego. So by meditation on anything other than ourselves, we cannot directly bring about the dissolution of ego. The only direct means to bring about the dissolution of ego is not to attend to anything other than ourselves, but to attend to ourselves alone. Because when we attend to ourselves, this ego will subside and dissolve back into its source, because we will see what it actually is, which is Sat-Chit, which is the source from which ego has risen. So when we see ourselves as we actually are, all these dyads and triads will cease to exist. In other words, everything other than ourselves will cease to exist when we see ourselves as we actually are. So all this multiplicity appears only because we have risen as ego. And then he goes on to say, only those who have seen the reality. What he implies there is only those who have seen what ego actually is have seen the reality. When we see what ego actually is, what we are seeing is what we actually are. That is the reality. And then he says, they will not be confused. See, they will not be, that is, we are confused only when we rise as ego and see all this multiplicity. So the confusion is brought to an end by seeing ourselves as we actually are. Therefore, he ends up by saying, see. That what he implies by that is, see what you actually are. It can also be taken to mean understand what is said here. It can be taken in that sense, but the deeper meaning, this is an instruction. See yourself, see what this ego actually is, and then you will see the reality and you will not be confused. So this is a verse in which this principle, but everything else exists only in the view of ego. This is very clearly implied in this verse. It's not expressed so directly, but it's very clearly implied. There are various other verses that also imply this, but they're particularly the verses where Bhagavan is talking about knowledge and ignorance. This same principle is implied there, but it requires a bit more explanation. So I'm just touching upon those verses where this is most clearly explicit. It's very clearly explicit in verse 14. In verse 14, Bhagavan uses three terms: first person, second person, third person. First person means I, namely ego. And in fact, in the Kali Vemba version of Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, that is when he linked all the 42 verses together as one long verse, he added some extra 1.5 feet, metrical feet, at the end of each verse to link it to the next verse. So before the first word of this verse is tanmay. Tanmay means the first person. And in the Kali Vemba version, he wrote Udalnan ennum it tanmay. So Udalnan ennum means which is called I am this body. So he's clearly indicating what he means by the first person here is ego, which is what always experiences itself as I am this body. So what he says here is, if the first person exists, second and third persons will exist. Second and third persons means everything else, everything other than ourselves. In some translations, they put, if the first person pronoun exists, second and third person pronouns will exist. Bhagavan is not writing here about grammar. This is philosophy. And in philosophy, first person means the subject, the knower, namely ego. Second and third persons means all other things. In Tamil, these are not called three persons. The terms are tanmay for the first person. Tanmay means selfness. So or oneselfness. That is, tan means oneself. In the sense in which Bhagavan often uses it, it refers to oneself. It can also refer to, it's a generic pronoun, so it can also refer to other things. But this tanmay is derived from this word tan, and the may means ness, so it means selfness. So basically it means ourself. The second person is called munile. Munile means what stands in front. In other words, what we are experiencing directly, whether within our own mind, the thoughts that we are actually experiencing at this moment, thoughts or perceptions, or in the external world, what we're actually perceiving at this moment, that is the second person. And the word for third person is padake, which means what has spread out. So in other words, everything beyond our immediate experience, but things we know nevertheless, are what are called padake. But to keep things simple, second and third person basically means everything other than the first person. He also, in Nana, in the 5th paragraph of Nana, he also says a similar thing. So I'll just read what he says in the 5th paragraph of Nana, because that makes this verse even clearer. What he says in the last 4 sentences of the 5th paragraph of Nana, of all the thoughts that rise in the mind, the thought called I alone is the first thought. What he means when he talks about the thought called I is ego. In fact, he says that explicitly in the 8th paragraph, where there's a similar sentence, and then he says that what the thought called I is only ego. So of all the thoughts that appear in the mind, the thought called I, namely ego, alone is the first thought. The term he uses for first thought is mudal ninebu. Mudal can also mean primal, basic, original, or causal. So that is the base thought. That's the original thought. And then he goes on to say in the next sentence, only after this arises do other thoughts arise. That is, without ego, since all other thoughts exist only in the view of ego, they cannot exist without ego. So it's only after we rise as ego, but all other thoughts arise. And when he talks about thoughts here, he's using the word thought in the sense of mental phenomena of any kind whatsoever. In the previous paragraph, the 4th paragraph, he said, Ninivugale tavitu, excluding thoughts, jagam endro porol anyamai ille. There's no, there's nothing as world exists as separate. So the world is nothing but thoughts. And then he goes on to say, in sleep, there are no thoughts and there's no world. In waking and dream, there are thoughts and there is world. So in other words, the world is nothing but a product of thought. The world is nothing but sensory perceptions. And those, as he says in verse 6 of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, where he says the world is only the 5 kinds of sense impressions, nothing else. So all these sense impressions are mental impressions. And mental impressions are what Bhagavan, all mental phenomena of all kinds are what Bhagavan refers to as thought. So of all thoughts, the first thought is ego, which is the thought, what he refers to here is the thought called I. So only after this rises do all other things arise, all other thoughts arise. And then in the next 2 sentences, he, instead of talking about the thought called I and other thoughts, he uses these terms, first person, second person, third person. So in the next sentence, he's, after saying only after this first thought I rises do other thoughts rise, then he says only after the first person appears do second and third persons appear. The first person means ego, the primal thought called I. The second and third person means all other things, all other thoughts. And then in the final sentence he says, Tanmay Indri Munile Padikale Ira. Without the first person, second and third persons do not exist. So here also he's emphasizing this principle, but everything depends for its semi-existence upon our semi-existence as ego. So coming back to this 14th verse of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, what he says in the first sentence, if the first person exists, second and third persons will exist. And then in the next sentence he says, if oneself investigating the reality of the first person ceases to exist, second and third persons coming to an end, the nature that shines as one alone is oneself, the state of oneself. That's a little bit of Bhagavan packs a lot into a few words. So we have to think about it very carefully and to make sense of it. The first thing is, when he says, if oneself investigating the reality of the first person ceases to exist, this is again this principle that Bhagavan talks about, that if ego investigates itself to see what it actually is, or if it investigates its own reality, so if it tries to see what it actually is by looking at itself very carefully, ego will cease to exist. That's what he's saying here. So if one's self-investigating the first person ceases to exist. That implies if by one's self-investigating the reality of the first person will cease to exist. So that's the first part, the first message in this sentence. And then when this first person ceases to exist, second and third persons will also cease to exist, because second and third persons cannot exist without the first person, because they exist only in the view of the first person. So by investigating who am I, who is this ego, ego will cease to exist, and therefore all other things will cease to exist along with it. That's what he implies. If one's self-investigating the reality of the first person ceases to exist, second and third persons will come to an end. And when second and third persons come to an end, what will remain, that nature that shines as one alone, that means that isn't experienced as these three things, first person, second person, third person, but experienced as one alone, that is oneself. That is what we actually are. How he says it, tan nile me, tan means oneself. In this context, oneself, it refers to ourself as we actually are. And tan nile me means the state of oneself. It can also mean the nature of oneself. So what he implies here is when ego ceases to exist, everything else will cease to exist. And what will then remain shining as one indivisible whole, that is what we actually are. That's the implication of what he's saying here. But a very important point here that he makes very clear: how will the first person, how will ego cease to exist? Only by our investigating the reality of the first person. That is, when we investigate ourselves, superficially it seems we are investigating ego, because ego is what we now mistake ourselves to be. But if we attend to ourselves very carefully, attend to not to be adjuncts that ego takes itself to be, but that which takes those adjuncts to be I, namely the core of ego, the awareness. In Maharshi's Gospel, Bhagavan puts it very nicely. He explains that ego is what is called Chit Jatagranti. Chit Jatagranti means the not, but seemingly binds awareness with things that are not aware. Jada means what is not aware. Chit means what is aware. So chit refers to the real awareness that we actually are. Of course, the real awareness that we actually are is never bound. But when we rise as ego, we seem to be bound, because we mistake ourselves to be adjuncts. So this bondage, this knot is not real, but it seems to be, we seem to be subject to this bondage of taking ourselves to be this body, so long as we rise as ego. So ego is what is called Chit Jatagranti. The Chit portion is I am, the Jada portion is the body. So ego is that which is aware of itself as I am this body. But when we investigate ourselves, we're not investigating this body, we're investigating only I am. So what Bhagavan says in Maharshi's Gospel, in your investigation into when you investigate the ahamvriti means the I thought, in other words, ego, you take the essential chit aspect of ego. In other words, the I am portion of ego, not the body portion, but the I am portion, what ego essentially is. Because the body is just something other than ourselves, but we mistake ourselves to be. So if we're investigating ourselves, we're not investigating what we mistake ourselves to be, we're investigating what we actually are. That's what he refers to here as investigating the reality of the first person. In other words, we're investigating our own being, our own our own awareness, our fundamental awareness, I am. That is what we are to investigate. Often, in many books, it is recorded that people, because people can't help, most people who haven't understood Bhagavan's teachings deeply, they can't help but think in terms of two selves, one big self, one real self with a capital S, and one small s self with a small s. So small self is ego, and big self is that real big Brahman, whatever it is. So people think in dualistic terms. So people who haven't understood Bhagavan correctly, they often asked him, in who am I, does I refer to ego or to the real self? Bhagavan often said to ego. There's a reason why he said that. There are not two things. The question most people are asking is like, supposing you're walking with Bhagavan in the dim light of dusk along a path, and you see something lying on the path ahead of you. To you, it looks like a snake. So you say, oh, Bhagavan, Bhagavan, there's a snake. We must be careful. And you keep a distance because you're afraid of it. Bhagavan knows very well what it is. It's just a rope. So he assures us it's just a rope. But he knows that merely saying that it's a rope isn't going to remove our fear, because to us it still looks like a snake. So he says to us, look at it very carefully. If we then ask Bhagavan, which should I look at? Should I look at the snake or at the rope? What is Bhagavan going to reply? He'll say, look at the snake, because to us it looks as if it's a snake. But what if we look at the snake very carefully, what do we see? Oh, it's just a rope. There are not two things there, a snake and a rope. So the question, am I to look at the snake or at the rope, shows a lack of understanding. What seems to be a snake is actually a rope. Likewise, what seems to be ego is actually what we actually are, the Satchit that we actually are, the pure being awareness. So they're not two things. But because people ask the question, just like in that example, Bhagavan will say, look at the snake, because we mistake it to be a snake. He often said, look at ego. Some people, not understanding why Bhagavan said that, they said, oh, Bhagavan has said self-inquiry, the inquiry, who am I, is investigating ego. Therefore, we should investigate ego. It's wrong to say that you're investigating what you really are. There's so many places where Bhagavan makes it very clear that though we seem to be investigating ego, we are actually investigating what we really are. Because here, for example, he says, if one's self-investigating the reality of the first person. He doesn't say investigating the first person. He says investigating the reality of the first person. The first person is that adjunct conflated awareness, I am this body. But we are, this body is the jada portion, the insentient, the non-aware portion. What we are to investigate is the essence of ego, which is that I am, that awareness I am. So that's what he means here by the reality of the first person. Likewise, in so many other verses, he talks about investigating the place where I rises. The I that rises is obviously ego, but the place from which it rises, he uses the term place in a metaphorical sense. It's not literally a place, but when he talks about the place where I rises, he means the source, that from which we arise. From what do we arise? As ego, we arise from our own being. So the source from which ego rises, or the place from which ego rises, is I am, our own being. So when he said that we have to investigate the place where I rises, he means we have to investigate our own being. So again, he's implying we have to investigate the reality of ourselves. So if people say that you have to investigate ego, that's okay. But if they say It's only self-investigation is only investigating ego. It's not investigating what you actually are. They haven't understood Bhagavan correctly. Moreover, many people say, describe, when they talk about this practice, they say, I try to hold on to the I thought. Why to think of it in those terms? Why not simply think of in terms of holding on to I? Why do we have to bring the thought in? That is, as ego, we are just, that ego is a thought, but what we're investigating is not the thought element of ego, but the real element of ego, which is that essential awareness I am. So thinking in terms of holding on to the I thought, again, that shows, if we talk of it in those terms, it shows a lack of clarity of understanding. Bhagavan may sometimes in some contexts have expressed it in those ways, but that was suited to the understanding of whoever he was talking to. But we need to have a clear understanding. Even when Bhagavan talks about investigating ego, what he's actually talking about is investigating the reality of ego. Just like here, he says explicitly, tanmayin unmaye. Unmaye means the reality of the first person, the reality of ego, what ego actually is, which is that fundamental awareness I am, which is Satchit. So in this verse also, Bhagavan makes it very clear that as he does in that portion of the fifth paragraph of Nana that I read, but the second and third persons, in other words, all other things, depend for their seeming existence upon the first person, because they exist only in the view of the first person. So when we do not rise as ego, which is what he refers to here as first person, other things do not exist. As he said very explicitly in Nana, tanmay indri munile padake ira, padake gal ira. That means without the first person, second and third persons do not exist. In other words, without ego, all other things do not exist. So that's the 14th verse. Another verse that I'll talk about today is verse 23, because here also he's very explicit. But there are a lot of ideas he packs in this verse. What he said, he starts by saying, the body does not say I. And in the Kalivemba version, he says, because it is insentient, it does not say I. When he said the body does not say I, he means the body is not aware of itself as I. So it's not this body that's aware of itself as I. And then in the next sentence he says, no one says in sleep, I do not exist. So since it's not the body that says I is something other than the body. And even when we cease to be aware of the body or world or anything in sleep, in fact, we cease to be aware of everything other than ourselves, we don't cease to exist. We remain in the absence of everything else. So though awareness of phenomena ceases in sleep, the fundamental awareness of our own being, I am, that continues. We continue to be aware of our own being without being aware of anything else. We're not aware of time, we're not aware of space, we're not aware of anything whatsoever. We're only aware I am in sleep. That's not aware of the words I am, but what the words I am refer to, namely our own being. So we all recognize that we continue to exist in sleep. So no one says in sleep, I do not exist. How are we so confident that we existed in sleep? Why do we say I slept? Because we were aware of being in that state. Even though we were not aware of anything else, we were aware of being in that state. So when we wake up from sleep, we're very clearly aware that we were in a state in which we were not aware of anything. But in order to be aware that we were not aware of anything, we must have been aware. So what we were aware of in sleep is only our own being. even to say aware of is not quite correct, because that suggests our being is an object of awareness. Our being is not an object of awareness. We know ourselves in sleep just by being ourselves, because what we actually are is awareness, and awareness always knows itself. It always knows I am. That we cannot be aware without being aware that we are aware, and we cannot be aware that we are aware without being aware that we are. So, I mean, logically, we don't need such logic, but for those who doubt it, we can logically argue that awareness always entails self-awareness. We cannot be aware without being aware of our own being. Then in the next sentence, this is the sentence that I wanted to refer to, he says, Nan ondru arunda pin elam erum. That means, after one thing I rises, everything rises. The I that rises is ego. So when he says after one thing I rises, he means after ego rises, everything rises. So that implies nothing else exists when we do not rise as ego. Only when we rise as ego does everything else come into existence. I mean, he ends by saying, contemplate by a subtle mind where this I rises. Where it rises is from our own being. If we attend to our own being, he doesn't say it here, but I'm just explaining this. Why he says that we have to contemplate by a subtle mind where this I rises. Where I rises is our own being. If we contemplate that is, if we attend to our own being with a keen and subtle mind, this I will die. This will subside and dissolve back into its source. Now, I will die. That's why he says it here. And in the Kali Vemba version here, he says, when one contemplates by a subtle mind where this I rises, I will slip off. It will cease to exist. In other words. So here also, he in this verse, he makes it very clear, after one thing rises, I rise, everything rises. But this idea, this principle number 7 that we're talking about now, this is made most clear by Bhagavan in verse 26 of Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu. Here is where he summarizes what he has said in so many verses previously. What he says in this verse is, Ahande undayin anetum undahum. That is, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande indrail indru anatum. If ego does not exist, everything does not exist. Why does he say this? Because everything here means all phenomena. In whose view do all phenomena seem to exist? They seem to exist only in the view of ego. So only when we rise as ego do phenomena seem to exist. And when we do not rise as ego, they do not seem to exist. Therefore, he says, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego does not exist, everything does not exist. Note that here he doesn't say when ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. He only says if ego comes into existence, because if we investigate ego, we will see that there's no such thing at all. It has never come into existence. Therefore, nothing has ever come into existence. Therefore, the ultimate truth that we will discover when we know what we actually are is what is called ajata. We will know that there has never been any arising or cessation. There has never been any bondage or liberation. We always were as we always are, as just pure Satchit. Nothing else, just pure being awareness, which are not two things, but just one thing, and which are the fullness of happiness, Ananda. So if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Ego itself is everything. What does he mean when he says ego itself is everything? That is, all phenomena are just an extension of ego. for example, when we are dreaming, what is it that we see as the dream world? We are seeing ourselves, or to put it in other words, we, the dreaming mind, are seeing ourselves as the dream. That is everything we see in the dream, the person we mistake ourselves to be, all the other people, the entire world we see in the dream, all the events that happen in the dream, all those are nothing but ourselves. We are seeing ourselves as all those things. So it's ego itself is everything means. Ego itself is what ego experiences as everything. Because there's no everything other, independent of ego. Ego isn't seeing some other thing as all of this multiplicity. Ego is seeing itself as all this multiplicity. So he says, ahandeya yavamam. This is a very, very important principle. In the Upanishads, it is said that all of this is Brahman. But here Bhagavan says, all of this is ego. Is this a contradiction? No, it is not. Bhagavan is here clarifying what is meant in the Upanishads. He's expressing the same truth, but in a more refined manner. Because if everything is ego, then what is this ego? If we investigate ego, we will find ego is nothing but Brahman. So ultimately, everything is Brahman. But if we say everything is Brahman, we're missing out an important step. Because if Brahman alone exists, and if everything is Brahman, does that mean Brahman is seeing itself as all this multiplicity? That wouldn't make sense at all, because if Brahman sees itself as something other than what it actually is, Brahman is always one. So if Brahman were to see itself as many, Brahman will be in ignorance. So Brahman, it's not Brahman that sees all this. What sees all this is ego. So that is, everything is ego, and ego is Brahman. We need to understand it in that way, in that sense. So though ego is actually nothing other than Brahman, when it rises, it seems to be something other than Brahman. That is, ego mistakes itself to be a body. And only when it mistakes itself to be a body does it see the entire world. So, but everything that it sees, all this multiplicity, is nothing but ego itself. So if ego investigates itself to see what it actually is, everything else will cease to exist. Ego will cease to exist, and therefore everything else will cease to exist. That is what he points out in the final sentence of this verse. Therefore, know that investigating what this is alone giving up everything. That is, investigating what this is means investigating what ego is. If we investigate ego, as he has indicated in so many verses, previous verses, particularly in the verse immediately before this, but he said in the verse immediately before this, verse 25, after saying that about ego, grasping form it comes into existence, grasping form it stands, grasping form and feeding on forms it flourishes abundantly, leaving form it grasps form. He then said, Tedinal autem pidicum. That means if sought, it takes flight. Tedinal literally means actually just if seeking. It doesn't say who is seeking what. But the implication is if ego seeks its own reality, if ego seeks to know who am I, it will take flight. That will run away. It'll cease to exist. So ego will. So if we investigate what this ego is, ego will thereby cease to exist. And when ego ceases to exist, everything else will cease to exist along with it. Therefore, know that investigating what this ego is giving up everything, Bhagavan says here. So we want to be free of all this multiplicity and all the trouble it causes us. The only way to be free of all this is by investigating ourselves and knowing ourselves as we actually are. And before I finish this, what Bhagavan points out in this verse, and in several of the verses we mentioned previously, particularly verse 14, verse 14 is most clear. It's also expressed by him in Nana, in the final paragraph of, well, we've already seen in the 5th paragraph, he's already said, the thought I alone is the first thought. Only after this rises do all other thoughts rise. Only after the first person appears do second and third persons appear. Without the first person, second and third persons do not exist. In other words, without ego, nothing else exists. And he says this same thing in the final paragraph, the concluding paragraph of Nana, paragraph 20. He says, the first 2 sentences are, Tan erendal sakalum erum. If oneself rises, everything rises. Tan adanginal sakalum adangum. If oneself subsides, everything subsides. The word he uses here for rises can also mean appear, and the word he uses for subside also means disappears or ceases to exist. So if oneself ceases to exist, everything will cease to exist. So again, here he's saying exactly what he was saying in verse 26 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, verse 14 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, the same truth he's expressing. And he also expresses this in the 7th verse of Arunachashtakam. In the first sentence of this verse 7 of Arunachashtakam, he says, Indraham enum nine veni enil pira ondrum indru. That means if the thought called I, in other words, ego, if the thought called I does not exist, even one other thing will not exist. So all that, again, here he's making it very clear, all other things depend for their semi-existence upon the semi-existence of ourself as ego. And then he goes on to say, until that is, until this I thought had been found to be ever non-existent, if any other thought rises, merge back within by investigating thus. To whom has it appeared? To me, what is the place from which I rose? Sinking thereby within, if one reaches the heart throne, one will be the very emperor seated under the shade of a single umbrella. That's a poetic way of saying you'll become God, the sovereign Lord of the entire universe. And then in the next sentence he says, the dream, namely the entire appearance of multiplicity, which I'll read the basic meaning and then I'll read it with explanations. The dream, namely inside and outside, the 2 actions, birth and death, happiness and misery, darkness and light, will not exist. What he means by that namely is, namely this entire appearance of multiplicity, which entails these pairs of opposites, such as inside and outside, the 2 actions, that's good and bad actions, good and bad karmas, death and birth, happiness and misery, darkness and light will not exist. So again, here he's implying that when we know, when this I ceases, when ego ceases to exist, everything else will cease to exist along with it. And he concludes this verse by saying, only the infinite ocean of the light of grace called Arunamalai, which dances motionlessly inside the court of the heart. What that implies is what will then exist is only the infinite ocean of the light of grace called Arunamalai. Arunamalai means Arunachala, which dances motionlessly, implying as I am only I, within the court of the heart. If it was dancing in any other way, as I am this or I am that, I am Brahman or something, you've got 2 things. There you've got a movement from one thing to another thing. But because he's dancing motionlessly, I is experiencing itself as I alone. There's no movement of attention away from I. I am I alone. That is the implication here. So in all these verses and all these passages of Nana, Bhagavan is repeatedly emphasizing this this principle, this um, this seventh principle. Our rising as ego is therefore the root cause for the appearance of all other things, including all problems and all suffering. Therefore, how to get rid of all these things? We need to investigate ego, because when we investigate ego, ego will cease to exist, and everything else, including all our problems and suffering, will cease to exist along with it. And what will then remain, as he says in verse 28 of Upadesha Undiyar, when one knows what the nature of oneself is, then anadi, ananta, akhanda, satchidananda. Anadi means beginningless. Ananta means endless, limitless, infinite. Akhanda means unbroken, undivided. Satchidananda. So one single whole, Satchidananda. It's beginningless because it precedes time. And that time is a phenomenon that appears only in the form of, in the view of ego. So it's beyond time, so it's beginningless. It's ananta. It's beyond all limits, all possible limits. So it's infinite. And it's akhanda. It can't be divided. It can't be broken up into pieces. It's one indivisible whole. Satchidananda, being, awareness, happiness. That is what we actually are. That alone is what actually exists. So, do you have any questions on that? Was that a clear explanation I gave of those passages?
Yeah, it was very clear. I was just feeling how extremely profound this is.
So simple, but so profound.
Yeah. Yes, you use a lot of words to explain the simple,
Yeah,
but it is necessary, especially
yeah,
if you might listen to this for the first time.
yeah,
But so extremely profound. So that was
yeah.
what I was
And
feeling.
it's the same thing that he's saying again. He's saying it in different words, but he's saying the same thing again and again and again.
Yeah. Um,
This is really the purest form of Advaita that we can find. There's no dilution. That in so many Advaitic texts are diluted because they're suited to the understanding of other people. But Bhagavan gives us the undiluted truth in all its naked simplicity.
yeah. If I have to speak for myself, which will probably be recognized by a lot of people, is I have a background as therapist, so but also from personal experience, I'm of course interested in suffering,
Mm.
and if you have a good understanding, a deep understanding of Bhagavan's teachings, where he explains, of course, the cause of suffering,
Yeah.
again, that's so extremely profound.
Mm.
And suffering is, of course, a topic that it's been talked about for hundreds, thousands of years in all kinds of philosophies and religions.
Yeah.
And rightly so, because if anything is personal in our life, of course, that is happy, joyful experiences. But it's the suffering, of course, that it's the most challenging, if we are experiencing in our life. And if you then hear about Bhagavan's teachings and you're think you're you're getting it, or you're kind of grasping what is referred to, namely, in essence, nothing other than having a false awareness about yourself, because your true nature is happiness, the
Yes.
opposite of suffering.
Yes.
Again, for me, that's so extremely profound. Yeah, I feel very blessed that I have found this teaching,
Yeah.
and the bit of understanding that I have.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do you know what is the aim of all of Vedanta? It's expressed in two very simple sentences. dukkha nivritti sukha prapti. That is removal of misery and the attainment of happiness.
Yeah.
And as Advaitins like to say, it is the removal of the ever non-existent misery and the attainment of the ever-existent happiness.
That's always a bit of the paradoxical, mind-blowing part of it, of course.
Yeah, because it's a great consolation.
Yeah.
If this misery were real, then even if we get rid of it, it may come back again. But the fact is, we are eternally happy. Happiness is our very nature. There is never a moment when we are not happiness, when we are not the fullness of happiness. We seem to be in misery only because of our rising as ego and taking ourselves to be this body. But if we investigate this ego, we will find there's no such thing. And therefore there never was any misery. We have always been and we always will be infinite happiness.
Yeah.
In Talk 107, someone asks, why does God permit suffering in the world? Should he not, with his omnipotence, do away with it at one stroke and ordain the universal realization of God? And Ramana says, suffering is the way for realization of God. And then the devotee said, should he not ordain differently? And Bhagavan said, it is the way.
Yeah, it's the nature of things. That is, we love to put the blame on God. God has created this world, therefore why didn't he create a better world? But why should we put the blame? God is there to help us get out of this mess. Let's not put the blame on God for us getting into mess. We've got ourselves into this mess, and therefore we rely upon the grace of God to help us get out of this mess. So putting the blame on God is it's just failing to notice the very nature of embodied existence inevitably entails suffering. It cannot be otherwise. You cannot limit yourself and experience yourself as infinite happiness. And nothing less than infinite happiness will satisfy us. So long as we rise as ego, we cannot experience the infinite happiness as we actually are. So we are dissatisfied. That dissatisfaction is itself suffering, and all other forms of suffering arise out of that. So, as Bhagavan said, it's the way. It cannot be otherwise. Such is the nature of things.
Yeah, specifically, didn't he also say somewhere, I don't have all the references, but that it's, or isn't that the reference with the lion and the elephant, that it's suffering can in that way be a wake-up call? At least that was it for me. Suffering was what made me a seeker, even though at the beginning I saw it I was seeking it.
It's why we all come to this spiritual path, because we are all suffering because we are not experiencing we are all craving the infinite happiness that is our own real nature.
Yeah.
Every action of mind, speech, and body is driven by this craving for happiness, because happiness, infinite happiness, is our real nature. So all karmas done by all jivas, all sentient beings, are all striving for happiness. But we think our happiness depends, because we've limited ourselves as this body, we seem to be dependent on things other than ourselves. If we get our food every day, we're happy. If we don't get our food, then we're hungry and we are unhappy. So it's we have made ourselves dependent, or made ourselves seemingly dependent on things other than ourselves. So naturally we are suffering. So the only way out of this is to know what we actually are. And the role of God, who is our own reality, who is what we actually are, the role of God is to help us know ourselves as we actually are. So at a certain level in religions, they say God has created all this. That's appropriate teaching to give to people at a certain level. But ultimately, why should we, when we say God has created all this, that in effect we're saying God has created all this mess, because this embodied existence, finite existence, is a mess. It's inevitable suffering. So why should we blame God for creating all this? All this is just a dream. It seems to exist only because we have risen as ego. So we have made the mistake, and God, it comes after us to save us. One of the words in Sanskrit for grace is anugraha. Anu means after, graha means grasping. So the implication of anugraha is that God has to come after us to grasp us and take us back to safety. Just like if a child is playing on the edge of the road and goes out into the road, the mother will come running after it and catch it and pull it back. By our rising as ego, we give God this task of coming after us to save us from ourselves.
Yeah.
In Shaiva Siddhanta, which is one of the many theistic systems of Indian philosophy, God is said to have 5 functions, panchakritya, that is creation, sustenance, dissolution or destruction, veiling, and grace. Creation, well, we all know what, that bringing the world into existence, sustenance, sustaining that world, dissolution is bringing the world to an end, because what comes into being has to cease. In order for all this to go on, all this play of creation, sustenance, and destruction appears only in the view of ego. So, and ego is in ignorance. So the 4th divine function is tirodhana, which means veiling. That is, in order for all this to go on, so long as we want to experience all this, God has to keep us in ignorance. But when we've had enough of all this, when we've seen through all this, when we know this is just we cannot find the happiness we're looking for in this world. And when we want to get out of this mess we've got ourselves in, then the final and the most important role of God is anugraha, grace. So because it's a theistic system, it has to cover all of these. But from the perspective of Bhagavan's teachings, essentially, ultimately, the role of God is one, saving us from ourselves. That's why he said God and Guru are in truth not different.
Yeah.
Because Guru is nothing but God who has come in human form in order to save us from ourselves by telling us to turn within and know ourselves as we actually are.
Yeah, if you take suffering, I'm very used because of my profession to look at it from a more psychological viewpoint.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to see, if you look at the psychological approach in suffering with the understanding of Bhagavan's teachings, that you see that it's clearly focused on an I am this or that. So still taking the patient or client or however you call it,
Yeah.
as a person,
Yeah.
of course, with the best intentions to help that person and heal
Yeah.
that person. But it's very interesting to become aware of this teaching or this truth, because for me it's kind of cracking the code of life.
But any solution that doesn't deal with the root cause is ultimately just symptomatic treatment.
Yeah.
So psychology, therapy, and
Yeah.
everything, it may ease the symptoms,
Yeah.
but it's not dealing with the root cause of the problem.
Yeah.
The root cause is our rising as ego.
Yeah. Yeah, I call that the true mental disease is taking ourselves to be this false
Yeah,
body and
exactly.
mind.
The mind itself is the disease.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
in that way, Bhagavan's teachings is like, and with the right concept, of course, about suffering, it's the end of therapy, right?
yes,
Clearly.
yes,
So that's why, yeah, I think this teaching about truth is so, yeah, it's so profound. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Sean, is there anything else you want to talk? Because we sometimes also talk about about suffering. Do you have some follow-up questions?
I've been studying a bit of Christianity, and I recently engaged with a expert on deification, which is an interest of mine aside from Bhagavan's teachings. And one of the things he was saying is, basically you can't get away from suffering, and suffering is sort of the messiness of life, and suffering is sort of part of the way to, it's just part of the path to union, in their view, union with God. And I've seen it a few times now where they kind of caricature the Advaitic perspective, or probably more realistically what they take to be the New Age perspective. And so they kind of think that, actually I could read it too, I wrote it down, but they kind of think that we think there's a way out of suffering, and it's sort of like we have the sort of naive happy-go-lucky view or something, but like we just read, Bhagavan said suffering is the way. So
Yeah. A lot of criticism of Advaita comes from not understanding Advaita. And there are plenty of people, not only the Neo-Advaitins, but certainly including the Neo-Advaitins, who misrepresent Advaita.
yeah, I'll just go, now that we brought it up, I'll just go ahead and say, he recently said this is how he defined pantheism, and I was hoping you could say to what extent you find this resonates with Bhagavan's teachings or does not. So he said, pantheism, all is God, we all become just God in the end, everything becomes God. The goal of the world is to all get sucked up and become God. Everything already is God and becomes that. It's all one big conglomeration. We lose our identity, our name, our particulars. Our personal identities are mixed up into one big glob.
Well, that's one way of putting it. If, as he says, we are already that, then there's no question of becoming. We are not becoming that. We are simply seeing what we always actually are, which is the one infinite whole. So we can describe it, but even Bhagavan has described it like a river merging in the ocean. So we can describe it as merging, but the truth is, it's not even merging. It's just shedding the false identification. That shedding of the false identification is what is poetically described as merging like a river in the ocean. So we are dissolving back into what we always actually are, our own being.
Yes, this was another thing the man said. Tell me what you think of this. It sounds similar to what you're saying. He says, I'm paraphrasing, you have to dissolve, be gone, and your individuality has to be wiped away. To become God, you have to lose yourself. In your whole identity, you no longer are who you are.
You're not, that last line is where he goes wrong. It's not you're no longer who you are, you're no longer who you mistook yourself to be. You are what you always actually were, which is God.
Yeah, and I think,
But,
I always think of it in
all
terms of like,
religions talk about self-surrender. We are to give ourselves to God. Why should we have any reservation? Why not give ourselves wholly to God? If we give ourselves wholly to God, then God alone remains. When a river is discharged in the ocean, it's no longer a river, it's the ocean. It has lost itself in the ocean. So if we are serious about self-surrender, we must be willing to give ourselves wholly to God. That means give up our separate existence, our so-called individuality.
Another,
The Christians also say, I believe in the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, one of the things they say about God, he's the fullness of being. That's a beautiful description, but they don't follow up to what that logically implies. If God is the fullness of being, there is no being other than God. If there was some being other than God, God wouldn't be the fullness of being. So the fact that if God is infinite, as we all believe he is, then how can we be other than God? And why should we, if we still desire to retain our individuality, our separate existence, that means we're not wholly in love with God. If we were wholly in love with God, we would want to give ourselves wholly to him. We wouldn't want to retain our separate existence. So those who are unwilling to give up their separate existence, they're fine. And all these beliefs, it's fine at their own level. As Bhagavan said, it's the way. It's all part of the course. But sooner or later, if we want to experience infinite happiness, which is our own real nature, we need to be willing to give up all separation. So we need to be willing to dissolve in God. And if God is the fullness of being, God is always our being. We are never anything other than God. So our seeming separation from God, our individuality, our seemingly separate existence is even now it's not real. So if we want to know God as he is, we can know God as he is only by knowing God as God knows himself. And God knows himself just by being himself. So we need to be God in order to know God. Otherwise, if we try to know God without giving ourselves wholly to God, we are seeing God through the very narrow perspective of our separate existence, our finite mind. Many people don't like that. That's why there are so many different forms of theism. Even within Vedanta, there's not the majority of Vedantins are not Advaitins. The majority of Vedantins believe in some sort of theism. They think there's some sort of separation between themselves and God. There are different conceptions of how that is, but they believe in some sort of separation. Only in Advaita we say, yes, there seems to be separation, but that separation is not real. Because if that separation were real, then we'd be reducing God to something finite. If we are something other than God, then God is not infinite. There's God plus us. So we are reducing God to just a finite thing like us. But if you study theology, there's so many different theologies. Every religion, every sect within every religion has its own particular theologies. If you want to study diverse theologies, see the other forms of Vedanta. There's so many different types of theology they have. So many different versions of theism, so many different beliefs of what is our relationship with God. But it's complicated. But if you've got God plus others, then you've got complexity. Advaita is the ultimate parsimony, the simplest of the simple, the simplest of the simplest of the simplest. You cannot get more simpler than one only without a second. And that is what we always are. Tattvamasi, you're always that.
Yeah, and really briefly, another misunderstanding he had was, maybe this is New Age, I don't know, but he said it's based on his understanding of pantheism. It's like I can say I'm a god and you're a god, which that also is false.
Yeah. It's not, so long as you say I am God, God doesn't say I'm God. God just is God. He doesn't need to say I am God. That is, that which says I am this or I am that is ego.
Yeah, and then it's still multiplicity, like I'm a god and you're a god.
Yeah, then we got
God.
multiple gods.
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah.
When did the Advaitic interpretation of Vedanta begin? Was that like in the 600s or so with Gaudapada, or earlier?
Well, Advaita is very, very clearly there in the Upanishads. But you can also say various other interpretations are there in the Upanishad, but they're definitely very, very strong Advaitic implications. In fact, very explicit. When it says one only without a second, when it says Brahman it defines Brahman as Satyam Jnanam Anantam. Anantam means infinite. There cannot be anything other than the infinite. So Advaita is so clearly implied in the Upanishads, in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Brahma Sutra, but these things began to be formed into systematic philosophies much later. So the earliest record we have of someone giving a specifically Advaitic interpretation of Vedanta is Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika. And Gaudapada had a disciple, Govindapada, and Govindapada had a disciple, Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya is the first one who systemized it on that Gaudapada wrote his Karika on the shortest of all the Upanishads, the Mandukya Upanishad. Shankara wrote commentaries on the 10 most important Upanishads, 10 or 11. I think there's some doubt about one of them, whether he was written by him or not. But it's at least 10 Upanishads he wrote commentary on. He wrote a detailed commentary on the Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita. He was the first one to systemize a philosophy of Vedanta. A few hundred years later came Ramanujacharya. But that doesn't mean that these different interpretations were not there earlier. They just weren't systemized.
I remember when we first started corresponding many years ago now, one of the things I asked you about was, I think his name is Dennis Waite. I know you've corresponded with him a bit too. Is that his name? But he wrote a book called
a long time ago.
Something about 5,000 years of Advaita, and you said, well, that's not accurate. I can't remember how many years you said, but it wasn't 5,000 years of Advaita.
I mean, there's quite possibly there were people having this experience 5,000 years ago, but explicitly Advaitic interpretation dates back to Gaudapada. That doesn't mean it began with Gaudapada. That is, the systemization of it began with Gaudapada. Or that's the earliest record we have of systemization. There may have been earlier people who had systemized it. In Sanskrit, in ancient Sanskrit texts, there's so many references to other texts that nowadays aren't extant. So whatever history we have of these things will always be incomplete. And the Vedas, for thousands of years, the Vedas were an oral tradition. So that oral tradition continued even after writing, these things began to be written. So there may have been an oral tradition of Advaita long before even Gaudapada. But the earliest written record we have of a Advaitic interpretation of the Upanishads is Gaudapada.
If you had to estimate when an Advaitic interpretation began, roughly what year might you say? Or how long ago?
It's futile to try to do so, and it's meaningless. But we, as Bhagavan said, trying to know about the past and future without knowing the truth of the present is like trying to count without knowing the value of one. If you say I've got 10 XYZ of carrots, if you don't know the value of XYZ, saying you've got 10 XYZ means nothing. Does it mean 10 grams, or does it mean 10 kilos, or 10 tons, or 10 shiploads? So we need to know the value of one. If we know the truth of the present, the past and future will both cease to exist. So all this concern about whether it's 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, this is all irrelevant.
It's the eternal truth.
What we are trying to know is, who am I here and now?
And then here and now reduces actually to oneself anyway, because really here and now is just I am.
Yeah, exactly. It's the presence of ourself that makes the present time and present place seem to be present. So ultimately it all comes back to I, which is eternal and unchanging. So let us know ourselves as we actually are and forget everything else.
Thank you, Michael.
Right.
There's still something that I want to bring up about the suffering part, because we are aware of, and we even had that one experience one time in a talk with Bernardo Kastrup, that there can be misunderstandings about Bhagavan's teachings and the Advaitic perspective, only one without a second. And if we're talking about suffering, because it might seem that people who are walking this path, and maybe some act like that, seem to be indifferent. But if I look at it, because the one who is suffering, the sufferer itself, is in essence non-existent. There's only Atma Svarupa, our own real nature.
Yeah.
So that can seem extremely indifferent, of course. But for me, it seems that the ultimate compassion, which is nothing other than the ultimate love, is actually seeing what you truly are, and the misunderstanding about what you are not. Of course, I can understand that not everyone is willing to accept that teaching, so it doesn't make sense to tell someone who's truly suffering.
That talk we had was my mistake. I talked things that I shouldn't have talked, because I was talking to someone who wasn't. There's no use telling Bhagavan's teachings to someone who is not ready to accept them.
Yeah.
Because they'll misunderstand, they'll twist it, and so it's futile. It's futile.
But I was wondering if you perhaps could talk a bit about, because sometimes you say things in a way that are so extremely beautiful, about compassion, and also related to Bhagavan, because there are, of course, many stories where on the one hand, Bhagavan is completely indifferent about what is happening. Something with someone was being kidnapped and he completely didn't respond. And other times he is weeping with a devotee who has something.
We cannot predict anything with Bhagavan. What does compassion mean? Com means with, passion means suffering, suffering with. So long as we have a very strong sense of self, of a separate self, that will impact the degree to which we can experience compassion. The more our sense of a separate self dissolves, the more compassion will be natural to us. If I'm very wrapped up in myself, if I care only about myself, if I see others suffering, it won't bother me, because all I care about is my own happiness. And so long as I'm okay, I mean, there are people who actually take pleasure, they're masochists, not masochists, sadists, people who take pleasure in causing suffering to others. So that shows a very unrefined mind and heart. But as we become more and more refined, morally refined, by dropping this, or we haven't completely dropped the sense of a separate self, but we are at least reducing the strength of this sense of separate self. The more this sense of separate selfhood is reduced, the more naturally compassion will flourish. It pains us to see others suffering. So being pained by seeing others suffering, that is literally compassion. So the compassion will grow as we subside more and more, our compassion will grow. But the fullness of compassion can be experienced only when Bhagavan is the ultimate example of complete compassion, fullness of compassion.
Yeah, one of the things that I used to
But
say.
we can't always see that in reactions. We see signs in reaction, but Bhagavan's compassion is far deeper than anything that our mind can conceive.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess we can equate compassion with grace.
Yes, well, in Sanskrit it's the same word.
Oh, okay.
Karuna means grace. It also means compassion.
No, because I can, it's very helpful on walking this path to see the things that happen to us that we dislike, to see them as Bhagavan's grace working and for our own spiritual benefit. So in that way, it's his compassion at work, even though we as identifying as this person with this body don't agree with it, of course, what happens. But yeah.
Whether we call it compassion or grace or whatever, it is the infinite love that he has for us as himself.
Well, it does help to remember in Viveka. Well, it's so a habit again, as if you experience something that causes suffering, to kind of identify yourself with it and to be completely taken hostage by it.
Yeah.
So it's very, for me, for example, very helpful if I kind of do a mental reset using Bhagavan's teachings. To see it as Bhagavan's grace or Bhagavan's blessing, and one of the things I say is the loving invitation that is there. And the deepest invitation, of course, is always see who you truly are. Who's the one who is suffering, and what is the reality of that one who is suffering? Yeah. That makes it, of course, such a simple form of therapy in a way. Okay. Yeah, but it's anything but indifferent.
Bhagavan's therapy can be summarized in one word: subside.
Yeah.
The more we subside, the more we are healing ourselves.
Yeah.
And when we subside so completely that we dissolve back into our source, that is the ultimate healing.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And healing, I think, comes from the same, etymologically, it comes from the same root as whole.
Yeah.
So we become whole again.
Yeah.
We become what we actually are, the infinite whole.
Yeah.
That is the ultimate healing.
Yeah. Okay. I have nothing to say anymore. I think it was already very beautiful. So Sean, unless you still want to ask something, we can go to the two questions that Michael wanted to respond to. Yeah?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, is that okay for you?
Yeah, sure.
because there were two comments from different persons on the previous meeting that we were having, and you wanted to reply to those comments.
Yes.
So let me read the first one, which is a little bit of a longer text. And this person is referring to a verse in Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu where Bhagavan is calling ego Pisha. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Pisācha.
Pisācha. Yeah. So yes, shall I read the verse?
Yes.
Yeah, which means demon. Why would Ramana say Pisācha? That's very distinct. He doesn't use words willy-nilly. I absolutely do not think that this illusory world is only one without a second. I think there is a spirit here that is not me. A Pisācha, Bhagavan even said this. Why are people not wondering why Michael keeps glossing over this? He laughs it away. Pisāchas are considered malevolent spirits associated with darkness and evil, often depicted as possessing humans. Yeah, I think this was the part. Then the rest is a little bit of a comment from you. I don't know if you have.
But yes, well, yeah. that is for this comment. But this person who's written this comment, he has written many comments like this. So I just gave an example of another comment in some other place where he had written. And as I've said before, Bhagavan is precise with his words, and he would never use the term Pisācha loosely. There are evil forces working against our progress, finding who we are. I've learned that this non-reality is nothing like I thought. Maybe if you saw that, you'd let yourself off the hook as far as not having love to know who you are. We are innocent, and ego is of this existence. And Stuart's statement, no cause for ego, unknowable reason for ego rising. There is an evil force. It's not tangible. It's Pisācha. We are innocent. So I'll answer this now. That is, Bhagavan doesn't actually use the term Pisācha. In verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, he refers to ego as Uruvatra Pei Ahande. The Tamil word pei is more or less equivalent to the Sanskrit Pisācha. A Pisācha is something like a goal. It is a malevolent spirit that is said to possess corpses in the cremation ground, and they're particularly characterized by possessing other beings. This is why Bhagavan referred to ego as a Pisācha. There is a verse in Guruvaccha which makes it clear why Bhagavan, well, as I say, Bhagavan didn't use the term Pisācha. The term Bhagavan used is the Tamil term pei. He used this term in verse 25 of Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu. Yes, verse 25. He also used it in Guruvaccha, verse 167. What he says in that verse is, he's using the same words he uses in Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu. That is, he refers to ego as a hande, and he refers to he talks about goals. That is, he uses the same term pei, which means more or less like a Pisācha. What he says in that verse is, being completely bound by complete delusion, the ego life undertaken by all sentient beings in the three worlds is nothing other than a dance of goals possessing corpses in a cremation ground. In fact, it's a little bit more. There's one more word there in the original. Possessing, he said, possessing pyre corpses. Pyre corpses means corpses that have already been put on the pyre, on the funeral pyre. So, but the idea that corpses have been put on the funeral pyre, but not yet burnt, and the demons come, these ghouls, these pei come, and they possess them and they dance. Bhagavan likens the life of all sentient beings, the ego life of all sentient beings, to such demons dancing the cremation ground. Why he says like that is, this ego is like a pisasha. It's something that has taken possession of this body. This body Bhagavan often refers to as a corpse. So this, because this body is just a living corpse. What's the difference between a corpse and a living body? It's only that there's now we experience this body as I. When death comes, this same body which we now experience as I is just going to become a corpse. So actually this body is nothing but a living corpse. So the ego has possessed this body, just like these pasashas possess corpses in the cremation ground. And having possessed corpses, they then dance around. So our whole life is nothing but a dance of demons who possessed corpses in the cremation ground, according to Bhagavan. So obviously he's using this, this is an analogy he's using to depict the nature of our life. This person who's written this comment seems to be implying that Bhagavan used the word pay or pisasha, but Bhagavan didn't use the word pisasha, he used the word pay, but the equivalent is pisasha. But Bhagavan uses referring to some external beings. Bhagavan is not talking about external beings. He says ego itself is this pisasha. And he makes it very clear, when ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. So there's no external evil force. The only evil is this our rising as ego. So to say that we are innocent is missing the point. That is, by rising as ego, we become guilty. We are guilty of Brahmahatya. Brahmahatya means the sin of killing a Brahmin or killing Brahman. In effect, by rising as ego, we have in effect killed Brahman. Brahman is what we always actually are, but when we rise as ego, we seem to be this small, finite person that we take ourselves to be. So this is what is sometimes metaphorically described as Brahmahatya. And in order to atone for the sin of Brahmahatya, we need to sacrifice ourselves. We need to surrender and merge back into our source in order to restore Brahman to its real state. Of course, Brahman is never affected by our rising as ego. This is all often, that is, things are often described poetically to clarify certain points. It's not to be taken literal. That is, when we say not to be taken literal, it's not that we don't take the analogy seriously. When Bhagavan says ego is a pay or a pasasa, we need to consider very carefully why he says like that. That is, ego is the root of all evil. Whatever evil we see in the world, the root of it is ego. There's no evil other than ego. That is, in Advaita, there's no external Satan like they have in some religions. That is the root of all evil is within ourselves. By limiting ourselves as I am this body, we bring all these pairs of opposites, good and evil, life and death, existence and non-existence, knowledge and ignorance, bondage and liberation. All these pairs of opposites are brought into existence only by our rising as ego. Early on in this talk, I talked about verse 9 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. There, Bhagavan makes it very clear that all pairs of opposites exist only for ego. So evil is part of a pair of opposites, good and evil. The ultimate reality is beyond, it is the good that is beyond both good, beyond the pair of opposites of good and evil. That is, there are no pairs of opposites in the ultimate reality. It is the ultimate good. So evil exists only in the view of ego. So evil is brought into existence by our rising as ego. So in that sense, ego is a demon. That's why Bhagavan refers to ego as Uruvatra Payahande, the formless demon or goal ego. Ghoul, I don't know how it's pronounced, goal or ghoul. I think the English word goal, which is, it comes from an Arabic word ghoul. Ghoul, I think, means a demon, but exactly like a pisasa, but possesses corpses in cremation grounds, or feeds on corpses, sometimes it's described. But it's all very, very much the same sort of idea. So all trouble is caused by ego. That's what this whole video is about. That is the seventh principle. Our rising as ego is therefore the root cause for the appearance of all other things, including all problems and all forms of suffering. And we can also add to that all evil. It's all, the ego is the root cause of it all. But what Bhagavan is not saying is that there's an external evil force, as this person seems to have misinterpreted. Bhagavan is not saying there's any external. It's all, we are the cause of all problems. We are the solution to all problems. That is, our rising as ego is the cause of all problems. Our subsiding back into our source and being as we actually are is the solution to all problems. So there's nothing external. If we want to look for evil, we need look no further than within our own heart. But this evil seems to exist only so long as we rise as ego. If we investigate this ego, as Bhagavan says in that very same verse 25, Tedina autum pidicum, if sought, it will take flight. So to get rid of this pisasa, this pisasa ego, this evil ego, all we need to do is to look at it very carefully and it will subside back into its source. When I say look at it, that means look at ourselves very carefully. We as ego will thereby subside back into our source and all evil will end forever. This answer may not satisfy this person because this person seems to have a very fixed idea of what Bhagavan means there, but it's very, very clear from that Bhagavan is saying there, he uses the word pay to describe ego, not to describe any external force. It's ourself as ego that is this pay, this pisasa, this evil demon ghoul.
So the second comment you wanted to reply to is a person, Sinatangam, who asked, is there any difference between I am, being, and thinking that I am awareness? How to differentiate this experimentally? Thank you.
Right. I am, it's referring to our own being. I am is our being. It's our awareness of our being. That is, our being and our awareness of being are one and the same. And they are what are expressed by the words I am. I am means I exist. Because this person, Chinnatangam, seems to be a Tamilian from his name, Irikarain. Irikarain is being. Irikarain means, in Tamil, we don't have to say I am. I mean, we can say Nan Irikarain, that means I am. But generally in Tamil, it's more natural just to say Irikarain, because the I, that means just am, because the I is included in the am. The am refers only, it's a form of a verb, but it's a first person form of a verb. So am cannot refer to anything other than I. So in Tamil, irikarain. Irikarain is irupu. That is, am is being. So I am and being are one and the same thing. I am is the being of ourself. When we talk about the being or existence of other things, those other things that seem to exist or seem to have being, they are only in our view. They exist only in our view. So they borrow their semi-existence from the semi-existence of ourself as ego. And we as ego borrow our semi-existence from the real existence of ourself as we actually are. The real existence of ourself as we actually are, our very being, is I am. So I am and being are one and the same. Regarding thinking, I'm awareness. Thinking is a mental activity, so it cannot be the same as being. Being is eternal. We always are. We are always aware I am, whether we're thinking or not. We're aware I am in waking. We're aware I am in dream. We're aware I am in sleep. So I am, the awareness I am is our very being. It's what underlies everything. Whereas thinking that I am awareness is merely a mental activity. Like anything, thinking of any sort is a mental activity. So that is clearly different from our being. We don't need to think I am awareness. We are aware of us. Because we are aware, that means we are awareness. We are what is aware. Awareness in the sense of what is aware. We don't have to think I am what is aware. We already know we are what is aware. Thinking I am this or I am that is not going to, it's, but as Bhagavan says in Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, thinking I am that, I am Brahman or whatever, may be an aid, but is it vichara? So there's no need for us to think I am awareness. What we need to do is to investigate this awareness I am, to know ourselves as we actually are. Thinking I am this or I am that it's just a mental activity. That's not going to solve the problem. Who is thinking I am awareness? Only after we rise as ego, but we can think I am awareness, or I am Brahman, or I am Shivoham, I am Shiva, or anything. All this is possible only after we've risen as ego. So we are told that we are Brahman in order to make us investigate ourselves. As Bhagavan says in verse 32 of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, when the Vedas declare you are that, what should our response, I'm paraphrasing here, and what is the implication of what should our response be? When the Vedas tell us you are that, our response should be, oh, if I am that, then what am I? We should investigate ourselves. And by investigating ourselves, we will know and be what we actually are. That's what we should be doing. Instead of that, thinking I'm not this body, I'm that Brahman. Wait a minute, I'll get the whole verse. What Bhagavan says is, I'll read the Tamil because I think this person who's asked this question is a Tamilian. Aduni Endru Ammaregal Artidavum. That means when the Vedas proclaim that is you, Tane edu endru tan tendu iradu. Instead of being, knowing oneself as what? Adunan idu andru endru ennal uranin mayinal. Thinking I am that, not this, is due to non-existence of strength. Endrum aduve tanai amavadal, because that alone is always seated as oneself. That is, we are always that. So if we are just thinking, I am that, not this means not this body, that is only due to absence of strength. The strength he's referring to here is the clarity of understanding and the consequent bhakti and vairagya. If we clearly understand but what we actually are is Brahman, we will we will naturally have love to know and to be what we actually are. And we will also have the clarity to understand, but merely repeating, I am that, not this, is not going to, is not going to, is not going to enable us to know ourselves as we actually are. We have to actually investigate ourselves. That's why he said, instead of, how do you say it? Tanne edu, endru, tan, tendu iradu. That means, tanne means oneself. Edu means what? Edu endru means thus. It implies, edu endru here implies investigating what? Meaning investigating what am I? So knowing oneself by knowing oneself by investigating what am I. Iradu means well, iru means being, iradu means not being. So that implies instead of being, knowing oneself by investigating what am I, just thinking I am that, not this, is uranin meinal. It is due to lack of strength, lack of strength of discrimination, of strength of understanding. If we really understood why the Vedas say you are that, that is, before the Vedas tell us you are that, we are seeking something outside ourselves. We're seeking happiness in the world, we're seeking knowledge, we're seeking this or that. Eventually we come to seek God or seek Brahman, something that's beyond all this world. We're still looking for it outside. So the Vedas come and tell us what you are looking for outside, the happiness or the Brahman or the God or whatever it is, you yourself are that. So when they tell us you are that, what should we do? We should turn our attention within to find out what am I. That's the real understanding. Instead of that, if we simply start telling ourselves, I am that, I'm not this body, I'm that Brahman, I'm not this body, I'm that Brahman, thinking that is, it's, as Bhagavan says, it's due to non-existence of strength. It's lack of clear understanding. We're missing the point. People go on talking for hours about explaining this Mahavakya, you are that. They first explain what is you, what is meant by you, what is meant by that, what is meant by is. They analyze it and everything. Ultimately, that's all missing the point. Maybe for those who aren't ready to come to this, Shankara has written a detailed commentary on this, Tattvamasi, but he did so for those who were not ready to come to this path. But for those who are serious spiritual aspirants, as soon as the Vedas tell us you are that, we should then say, then we should stop thinking about Brahman. We should think about, if that Brahman is myself, if I am that Brahman, then what am I? We need to turn our attention within and investigate ourselves. Then only can we know ourselves and be what we actually are. So there's a big difference between being, which is just being as we are, and thinking I am awareness, or I am Brahman, or I am that, or I am Shiva, or I am God, or whatever. That is merely, thinking is just perpetuating. Who is thinking? Ego is thinking. So by thinking anything, we are perpetuating ego. We're trying to replace, now we're experiencing ourselves as I am this body. We hope to get rid of this false awareness, I am this body, by replacing it with some other thought, I am that Brahman, I am awareness. That's not going to work. All we need to do is to turn within to see what we actually are. So I hope that's a clear answer for Chinnatangam.
Yes, thank you for that. I do want to ask a follow-up question that I think it's related to what you just talked about, because in previous Q&As on the Q&A channel were two comments with questions placed, and I think they're I think they're good questions. It's about the practice, and I just shared them in the chat if you want to read with me. But I will read them, and there is an overlap between the two. The first commenter asked, "How do I go to my true self in self-inquiry? It seems my ego, I, between brackets, just goes to a sublime, peaceful, temporary version of itself in meditation. It seems I cannot reach my I, and between brackets, witness." And another commenter said, in practice, how does one even start with holding on to I am? When I sit down and try to concentrate on I am, I cannot find it. I just get bored. I had to laugh a little bit when I read this. So one goes into a peaceful state and the other one gets bored. Yeah.
Okay. I'll deal with the second one first. I am is not a thing we are looking for. The I that says I cannot find it is itself the thing that it says it cannot find. Saying I cannot find I am is like saying I cannot find myself. Well, it is saying I cannot find myself, but I cannot find I. What does that mean? It's obviously absurd. That is, we are all aware of ourselves. We are not an object. We are not a thing to be found. We are the awareness in which all things appear and disappear. All phenomena appear and disappear within us. So we are not anything, we cannot be anything that appears and disappears within us. We are that in which and to which all things appear and disappear. That is why Bhagavan often gave us this clue, investigating to whom. That investigating to whom means turning our attention away from whatever has appeared, back to ourself, the one to whom it has appeared. So we are not an object, but we all know ourselves very clearly. We are all constantly using this pronoun I. Why do we use this pronoun I? We often use this pronoun I to refer to the person we seem to be. But why do we refer to this person as I and other people as he or she? This person is no different to any other person, but I is something different to he and she. So what is it that distinguishes this awareness I? This is the first person awareness, the awareness of ourself. That is, I is that which is aware of all this. So what I essentially am is just that awareness. So we are withdrawing our attention from all the phenomena and fixing it on ourselves, the awareness to whom all these phenomena appear. This is actually an extremely simple practice, but people have difficulty grasping it if they continue thinking in terms of objects, looking for objects, for phenomena. I is not a thing like other things. It is the thing in which all other things appear and disappear. So it's the ultimate thing. And it's ourself. It's not something far away. It's ourself. So that's the second question. I hope so holding on to I am means simply attending to I am, remembering I am, not letting our mind slip away towards other things, keeping our mind, as Bhagavan says beautifully in Nana, he defines Atma-vichara as sadakalamum manate Atma-vichara. That means always keeping the mind on oneself. So keeping the mind on ourselves means keeping our attention on ourselves, on our own being. Regarding the first question, how do I go to my true self in self-inquiry? It seems my ego I goes to a sublime, peaceful. But well, firstly, we need to understand there are not two I's. There's not that is, self is one, I is one. I in its pure form, as just I am, just our being, that is what we actually are. When that same I is mixed with and conflated with adjuncts, as I am this body, I am this person, that which is aware of itself as not just I am, but as I am this person, that is ego. So it's the same I, but the difference between ego and the pure I is ego is the pure I conflated with adjuncts. So what we are investigating is not the adjuncts. The adjuncts means everything that we take ourselves to be, this body and mind, this bundle of 5 sheaths that we take ourselves to be, this person. That is not what we actually are. What we actually are is just the awareness I am. So we try to, when we investigating ourselves, we are trying to fix our attention only on this awareness I am. That's all. We are not looking for ourselves. We are looking at ourselves. That is, we are attending to ourselves. The more keenly we attend to ourselves, the more we as ego will subside. And when we subside completely by attending to us, that is, when we attend to ourselves so keenly that we cease to be aware of anything else, we will subside and dissolve back into the source from which we arose. In other words, the source from which we arose is our own being. So he says, it seems my ego I just goes to a sublime, peaceful, temporary version of itself in meditation. It seems I cannot reach my I witness. That is, I'll deal with the question of witness. That is, to say I cannot reach my I, it implies there are 2 I's, one I trying to reach another I. That is not... It's just I being as it is. That is, I have to be as I am. That's all. It's not, I am not trying to reach some other I. There's only one I, and this I that has now mixed and conflated itself with adjuncts needs to hold on to itself and thereby let the adjuncts slip off, and it will subside and dissolve back into its source. Regarding this word witness, we need to understand what this word means. That is, this word, the Sanskrit word is sakshi. It's used in many texts, particularly Advaitic texts. Bhagavan clarified that there are 2 senses in which the term witness is used. Sometimes the term witness refers to what is aware of all this. What is aware of all this is ego. So the witness in the sense of the knower is ego. But the term witness is also often used to refer to what we actually are, or Brahman. Brahman is a name for what we actually are. Brahman is sometimes said to be Jiva Sakshi, the witness of the Jiva. It's also sometimes said to be Sarva Sakshi, the witness of everything. Does that mean that Brahman is sitting there knowing everything and knowing the Jiva? No, not. That's a very crude understanding of it. As Bhagavan said, in that sense, which is the sense in which the term Sakshi is usually used in scriptures, in that sense, Sakshi means Sanadi. Sanadi means presence. So witness means presence. That is, it's in the mere presence of Brahman that Jiva rises and all else rises. That's why it's called the witness of Jiva and the witness of everything. But it doesn't mean it's knowing everything. It's just without the presence of Brahman, there couldn't be any rising of any Jiva or any appearance of anything else. But all other things appear only when we rise as ego, and they appear only in the view of ego. So this term witness, actually, there's a good reason why this term witness is used, but because people misunderstand it, it often creates more confusion than clarity. One reason why this term witness is used, when witness is used to refer to ego, the knower, is to help us to understand that we are not, now when we rise as ego, we identify ourselves as this bundle of 5 sheaves, this person, this body and mind. But we are not any of these things. We are not this body, we are not this mind. We are just, we are that is as ego, we are that which is aware of all these things. That is, the body and mind are objects that appear in our awareness. So we are the witness of them. We as ego are the witness of them. So this term witness, one of the reasons it's used is to help us distinguish ourselves as the knower, distinct from everything that is known. This process is what is called drik drisya viveka, distinguishing the seer from the seen, the knower from the things that are known. So the drisya, the seen, is all phenomena. The drik, the seer, is ego. That is, it's only in the view of ego that all other things appear. So ego is that in the view of which everything appears. So when we're investigating ourselves, we're not attending to any phenomena. We are just trying to attend to I. We are not even trying to experience a sublime, peaceful state. We are just trying to experience ourself alone. When, to the extent to which we attend to ourselves, other things will drop off. So that it may seem to be a sublime, peaceful state, but so long as we think of it as a sublime, peaceful state, our attention has gone away from ourselves. So we shouldn't try to label it. We should just try to focus our attention more and more deeply on ourselves. The more we attend to ourselves, the more we will subside. Because we can experience a sublime, peaceful state by other forms of meditation. But what happens then is, because of the meditation, the mind becomes calm and peaceful. But that calm and peace is just something that has appeared. So it's another phenomena. So we want to go beyond all phenomena. So forget about sublime, forget about peaceful, forget about everything. Who am I? We need to focus our entire attention, our entire interest on ourself alone, to know who am I. So we attend to I alone. And there's only one I. Call it ego, or call it the self, or call it true self, or whatever. It doesn't matter. There's only one I. That is what we have to attend to. We are that. We attend to ourself, attend to our own being, attend to that to which this pronoun I refers, namely ourself as awareness. Do you think I've answered those two questions adequately, or is there anything else I could say that could make it any clearer?
I think you did a wonderful job answering those questions. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I really wanted to bring them in because I
Yeah.
think these are questions and from genuine trying to understand, but a misunderstanding that is happening
Well,
with
I
a lot
mean,
of people.
what these two questions have in common, they both seem to think that they're looking for some I, other than the I that they are now, other than the I that they already are. But there aren't two I's. There's only one I. So
Yeah,
it's I attending to I.
yeah. Yeah, the constant remembrance that there is only one I, that is already so extremely powerful in the
Well,
subject.
if we understand that, it makes the whole thing much, much clearer.
Yeah, I can genuinely understand the misunderstanding because I
Yeah.
also had this on this path. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the witness was really like, oh,
Yeah.
I know where the witness is, and then you suddenly discover, oh, this is still ego because
Yeah.
it's a subject aware of objects.
Yeah, exactly.
And even being bored or having a peaceful experience is still an object. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything that appears and disappears
Yeah.
is an object or phenomenon. So it's something other than I. We say, I am bored, but that boredom is something, we're not always bored. We're not bored when we're asleep. Even if we're bored during much of a waking state, there'll be times when we're not bored. We're probably not bored when we're eating or when we're doing so many things that interest us. So boredom is just a state of mind that comes and goes. So it's something other than I. So it's not I am bored. I'm experiencing boredom as a phenomena. So to whom did this phenomena called boredom appear? To me. Who am I? We turn our attention back towards ourselves. Likewise, who is experiencing this sublime peaceful state? I am. So we turn our attention back towards ourselves. So we are not trying to attend to any experience, anything experienced. We're trying to attend only to the experiencer. And by attending to the experiencer subsides, and the underlying reality of the experiencer, which is the pure awareness I am, alone will remain.
Yeah, I do think it's a bit tricky, or at least also in my sadhana, because the moment I am deliberately being self-attentive,
Yes.
so kind of cut a train of thoughts and then asking myself, because that does help me, I turn around the attention to whom is disappearing. I do immediately get a sense of peace because I stopped the train of thoughts, which
Yes.
gives anxiety. So there is that sense of peace that arises, and I guess that happens with a lot of people. And
yes.
still, if I listen to you, you have to go deeper.
You have to go deeper, because
Yeah.
anything that arises is something other than ourselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What do you suppose it means when someone hears attend to your ego? What do you think they're going to be looking for when they hear attend to ego rather than attend to the basis of ego?
As Bhagavan said, according to the purity of the Antakarana, the same teaching reflects in different ways. So what each person understands is according to, it all depends on their clarity of understanding. If you understand Bhagavan correctly, attending to ego or attending to the place where ego rises is one and the same thing.
But when you were describing it earlier, I'm imagining
did the
someone
snake
sort
appear?
of thinking of their thoughts and their feelings, and I don't know what they're thinking of exactly, but
I don't know. But thoughts and feelings are not ego. Thoughts and feelings are thoughts and feelings. Ego is that which experiences those thoughts and feelings, that is aware of those thoughts and feelings.
and then that's not even what we're looking for. We're looking for the
No,
substratum.
we should, let's not jump back up. Attend to ego is quite sufficient. Because when you, just like if you look at the snake, what will you see? If you look at it carefully enough, you'll see it's a rope. So looking at ego and looking at ourselves is exactly the same thing. That's why, to whom did this appear? Bhagavan isn't asking us to ask the question. But if we ask it as a question, to whom does it appear? It appears to me as ego. So we are turning our attention back to face ego. But if we look at ego, we see what ego is, which is the underlying awareness. What is the source from which the snake has appeared? It is the rope. So looking at the snake or looking at its source are one and the same thing. So looking at ego and looking at the source of ego are one and the same thing.
I was just trying to be helpful in a practical way. Like, what is someone actually looking at when they're looking at ego? Like, what are they supposed to focus on?
I.
Okay. Which is not, it's the substratum, the being that we actually are.
Yeah. That's why Bhagavan says in Mahash's Gospel, as I was referring to earlier, he says, in your investigation into the source of the Aham Vritti, and he says source of the Aham Vritti, so that means the base. In your investigation into the source of the Aham Vritti, you take the essential chit aspect of ego.
Beautiful.
That is the I, it's only I we are attending to, not to anything else.
Well, I could imagine that it's the moment you say attend to ego, it is as if something exists that is called ego. So if you would say just attend to the beingness underlying the experience or something like that.
Yes, but all these things will be clear if we understand Bhagavan's teaching. Bhagavan says, if you look when he says, Tedinal autum pidicum, if thought it takes flight, that means if you look at ego, there's no such thing as ego to be found, but you'll see what underlies the underlying reality of ego, which is the pure awareness I am. But keep it simple. That's why Bhagavan didn't say, sometimes he says, like in verse 26, in investigating what this means ego. But whether he refers to it as investigating ego or investigating the source of ego or investigating the reality of ego, it's all the same. Because ego is I. The source of ego is I. The reality of ego is I. It's all I. The difference between ego and the pure I is ego is the pure I mixed and conflated with adjuncts. But what we're investigating is not the adjuncts, only I. So all we need to attend to is I. That's why Bhagavan often referred to this as the investigation, who am I? It's only I we are to attend to.
On another practical note, a lot of people have this question, and I'm wondering if you could answer. How do people attend to I even when they're at the computer, when they're talking, when they're going to work, dealing with the children, all sorts of things? How do you constantly attend to what you actually are?
Do we cease to be aware of I being when we attend to other things? No, we are always aware I am. I am doing this, I am doing that, I'm looking after the children, I'm attending to my work on the computer, I'm going to office, I'm sweeping the street, I'm doing whatever it may be, I'm chairman of the board of directors or whatever it is. I is the center of all that. Whatever we experience, I is the center of it, because it's I that is experiencing it all. So whatever we may be doing, we can at least be holding on to a tenuous current of self-remembrance. In the 11th paragraph of Nana, Bhagavan says, Oruvan tan sarupam adeyam varayal, Nirantara Swarupa Smaraneye Kai Patravanayan Adu Andre Podom. That means until one attains Swarupa, if one clings to uninterrupted self-remembrance, that alone is sufficient. So we just need to we need to try as much as possible to hold on to that remembrance of our being.
I have a question.
That's all that he says, Adu Andre Podom, that alone is sufficient. He makes it so clear.
I have a question that you won't like probably, but from what I've studied in various spiritual circles, it seems to me that you would qualify as what a lot of people would say as a jnani. You know, you study this one, that one, they've all attained. So I'm just curious, why don't you see yourself as someone who has attained ultimate truth? Like, obviously it wouldn't be you any longer, but because it seems to me that you speak from a deeper realization. But why aren't you fully self-realized or whatever?
Bhagavan makes it clear in, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about the experience of a jnani. He makes it very clear in the second verse of Arunachashtakam. What he says in this verse is, Kandavanevan ena karutinal nada, when investigating within the mind who the seer is, Kandavan indrida nindradu kandain. I saw what remained when the seer became non-existent. He doesn't, contrary to the way some people describe it, he doesn't say he saw the seer become non-existent. He said, I saw what remained when the seer became non-existent. So who is the I who saw what remained when the seer became non-existent?
Bhagavan. I am.
No. What remains when the seer becomes non-existent, that alone can see what remains when the seer becomes non-existent. In other words, it's not one thing seeing another thing. It is the pure I being itself. By being itself, it's knowing itself. So when investigating within the mind who the seer is, I saw what remained when the seer became non-existent. So that means he is that thing that remained. Because if he wasn't that thing that remained, he couldn't see it. And then he says in the next sentence, Kantanan enjina karitu era ille. That means the mind did not rise to say, I saw. And then in the next sentence he says, Kandilan enjina karuteru maring. In what way would the mind rise to say, I did not see? That is, since the mind doesn't rise, it cannot rise either to say, I saw, or I didn't see. So in that state of jnana, there's no rising I to say, I have attained, or I have not attained. It's beyond that. Then he says in the next sentence, Vindidu vilikidu viruluruvona, vindile panduni vilikine endra. That means, who has the power to elucidate this speaking when in ancient times you elucidated without speaking? That implies, who has the power to elucidate this by speaking when in ancient times even you as Dakshinamurti elucidated it without speaking? It cannot be expressed in words. Silence alone can convey the ultimate truth, because silence is the ultimate truth. Silence means the silence that is pure being. And then he concludes by saying, Vindidadu, Vindidadu unnile vilakida endre, vintalam achala ma vilangida nindrai. That means only to elucidate your nature, or state, it can mean either nature or state, without speaking, you stood shining as a hill between earth and sky. So Bhagavan makes it clear in this verse, when we see what remains when the seer ceases to exist, the seer is the rising I. So when the rising I has ceased to exist, how can any I rise to say, I have seen or I have not seen? That's why he says in Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, in verse 33 of Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, saying, I do not know myself, I have known myself, is ground for ridicule. In other words, saying either I do not know myself or I have known myself, both are equally ridiculous. Why? To make oneself a vishaya, an object, are there two selves? Is there one self to know another self? No. Then he said beautifully, being one is the truth, the experience of everyone. We all experience ourselves as one, so how can there be one I to know another I? So knowing ourselves is just being ourselves, and being ourselves means not rising to say I have known or I have not known. It's ridiculous to say I have not known myself, because everyone knows themselves, everyone knows I. The problem is, though we know ourselves as something other than what we actually are. So it's ridiculous to say I do not know myself. It's equally ridiculous to say I have known myself, because that would imply that after the annihilation of ego, there's an I to say I have known myself.
On the other hand, I can't help but think about someone like Muruganar, who's constantly saying, Bhagavan showed me this worthless dog or whatever, my real nature,
that
over
is
and over and
a major
over.
misunderstanding of Muruganar. Many people say, oh, Muruganar wrote all about his self-realization, so why shouldn't others talk about their self-realization? Muruganar did not talk about his self-realization. Muruganar talked about the grace of Bhagavan. If you, in the 14,000 verses in Ramana Jnana Bodham, it's all about Bhagavan's grace. And it's nothing about I mean, Ramana Bodham is a complete self-effacement.
which is self-realization.
Yes, yes, of course. But he said, what did I do? What, it's entirely Bhagavan's grace. It's all a praise of Bhagavan, greatness of Bhagavan's grace.
Very beautiful.
And he wasn't addressing people. He was a poet. So these poems were just pouring forth from him, because that was his nature. He was always composing verses. And he wasn't even bothered about preserving the verses. He would often write a verse on a slate, and when the next verse comes to him, he writes on the other side of the slate, and when the third verse comes, he writes off the first one and writes it there. So for many years, Sadhu Om would come to him every day and would quickly copy whatever was on the slate. But he didn't know. I mean, often we're going to say, oh, there were other verses, but I've forgotten them. Or sometimes we're going to say, oh, yes, I remember. And he would dictate and Sadhu Om would write it down. So Murugan was, he was talking, that it was all about Bhagavan. It was I mean, we are trying with our finite mind to understand the state of someone who is beyond the mind. But the ultimate import of all of Ramana Bodham is the supreme grace of Bhagavan. That's what it's all about.
Have we come to the end?
I think so.
You said something in the first part of this meeting, in this talk, about we are always happiness, we are always happy. And that made me feel so happy. I still feel happy because of that. Yeah.
Right.
There is great power in remembering the
Yes.
and yeah.
Yeah.
And really feel it in a way, not just intellectually, but just
we need not even remember I am happy. We just remember I am.
Yeah.
That itself is happiness.
That's true. Yeah. Well, then we have come to the end of this meeting, the 7th one, and we still have one left, the final one. You already referred to it because it's about investigating ourselves.
Yeah.
But we will talk about that, I guess, extensively.
So next time I can just repeat everything I said today.
Well,
as I always do anyway.
There's great power in repetition on this path. Yeah.
You say it over and over, but I've listened to, I suppose, every single one of your videos many times more than once.
I just want to say at least twice. Yeah. Yeah.
We were actually going to start watching your videos again from the beginning just for fun.
It's nice to bathe yourself in words of truth. Yeah.
These aren't my words, they're Bhagavan's words. That's why the power of these words comes only from Bhagavan.
Yeah. Well, thank you so very much, Michael, also Sean. So
okay, thank you both.
Namo Ramanaya.
Namo
Ramanaya.